welcome to the More Than a Game podcast, a podcast all about basketball, but it's also a lot more than that as well, hence the name More Than a Game. We're going to cover such things as leadership and leadership within sporting organisations, life in general. We're going to cover a myriad of things through each of these podcast episodes. And today we have veteran NBL administrator and general manager Jeff Van Gronigen with us. Jeff, welcome to the More Than a Game podcast.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's a privilege to be here on one of your early runs on this thing, so it's great.
Absolutely. We'll see how we go, hey? Glad you could join us, mate. As I said in the intro, you've had a big history, a long history in the NBL as a sports administrator, general manager. You were, I hear, the youngest assistant coach in NBL history. Is that still the case with Geelong back in the day?
Well, I know at the time that they talked a bit about that. I was 23 when I was named as a full-time assistant coach. I don't know if too many younger guys have been around it. I'm sure some intern coaches are often younger than that nowadays, but I think at the time it was considered to be very young to make a start in coaching in a full-time capacity, and it was a unique way to start. We had a very veteran-laden team too, with Cecil Exum and Ray Borner and some guys that were every bit of 10 years or 12 years older than me. So it was a thrown into the fire type situation. But yes, I was very young at the time.
Fantastic. So from there, you became a general manager at the Melbourne Tigers, and then Brisbane Bullets, had a couple of stints at the Sydney Kings, and now with the Adelaide 36ers. Been a fun ride, no doubt, up until this point. But if we can sort of rewind the tape a little bit, how did you actually get started in the sport of basketball?
Well, like so many, I guess, playing as a young kid is where it starts for most of us. I had a passion for the game that's probably shared by many. It's not an overly unique story, I think, for those that end up, in professional basketball in some capacity, that you usually start off like most of us, just shooting baskets, playing junior games. And my late brother, who was 10 years older than me, was a very good basketball player, and I started playing with him. And we had come out to Australia as an American family, and my heroes, the posters on my wall, was all about the Lakers, and coming out of California and going back to see relatives on a regular basis. I was always quite fixated on the NBA long before the NBA was anything really known here in Australia. And I was in Australian rules football heartland in country Victoria, an hour and a bit out of Melbourne. And but I had this huge passion for basketball, as well as enjoying footy and cricket and all those things that you grow up with in Victoria. But I guess I was a bit different because I was really, really fixated on the NBA. And again, this was well before the Jordan years, when I think most of the country got a bit enveloped in this. My heroes were Pat Riley, they all the way back, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The Showtime era at the Lakers was influential in capturing my imagination. And back then, Dan, believe it or not, there was no ESPN, there was no Foxtel, there was no ways of keeping up with these games except really two ways: Sports Illustrated and Street and Smith's basketball, and things that you'd find on big newsstand shelves, but they were usually 3 or 4 months old. And then a couple of video services that used to send NBA games out to Australia, and you'd get these games that were literally 2 or 3 months old. And you'd pour through them, and you'd envelop yourself in this NBA vision that you'd see of what were essentially just regular season NBA games, and you just watch them over and over and over again. And I can still remember specific games that I would watch 10, 15, 20 times, because you couldn't afford to buy, 82 games.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you'd watch one game 20 times.
Yeah, I remember those days.
Yeah, absolutely. And so those were different days, and I'd watch with my friends, and some of my closest friends, in particular a guy named Nick Ford, who went on to become a really good basketball player and played at what we now call NBL 1 level, and now coaches at that level, would share that with me, and we'd huddle around these TVs and watch these games. And to think of it now, when you have streaming and KO and constant live games, it's hard to imagine for the younger generation that you couldn't just watch a live game, but you couldn't back then. But I was lucky because I would be able to go back to California and see my relatives, and my brother and I would be able to go to NBA games and also NCAA college games.
Yeah.
So I was really fortunate that I was exposed to it. And look, it gives it builds within you a passion for the sport that you love.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess, how it really started. And later on, much later on, as I entered university in Victoria, I had started a basketball clinic company. And I was really fortunate because I had become friends with Andrew Gaze, Daryl McDonald, guys like Bruce Bolden, Leonard Copeland, even Shane Heal back then was very active in the clinics and camps, Brett Brown. There was a whole lot of people that I was fortunate enough to get to know and were very giving of their time. And it was commercial, but really it was more than commercial. It was really just hoping that those guys would come and share what you were trying to do. And I took basketball clinics to places that normally didn't have them. Well, when I say that, normally didn't have exposure to those guys. So I'd go to places that were 3 and 4 hours away from Melbourne. And I'd take Leonard and I'd take Daryl and I'd take Bruce and those guys and Andrew and we do these camps and clinics. And that's a long, long time ago now. But looking back on it, I think that was a bit of a pivotal moment because you'd learn how to administrate those camps, get to know the players, run things to a schedule, do some coaching, but also run things as a bit of a business. And that's how I started in the professional basketball scene. And that was my start.
Fantastic. You mentioned Andrew Gaze and some of those players from the Melbourne Tigers, and you spent a lot of time at the Melbourne Tigers. For me, one of the biggest clubs in NBL history, as second probably to the Perth Wildcats in terms of success, in my opinion. But yeah, you started your career there as in administration as a general manager. What was some of the things or the key, key things that you learnt in your time there that you were able to take into your career after and even now?
Well, actually, just a slight correction there, and because you like your history, I actually came into the Melbourne Tigers as not the general manager. I came in as the marketing director and was learning under Grant Cadee. So Grant, I owe a lot to Grant. Grant was actually the CEO of the Melbourne Tigers, and he brought me in as a employee with the vision of teaching me, help me understand about administration of a basketball club. Grant's the best in the business. He had made a transition from being a player agent to an administrator, although he did retain his overseas clients at the time. And Grant brought me in. So I wasn't initially in charge at the Tigers as the general manager. I worked for Grant, but it wasn't very long before Grant and Brett Brown actually headed to Sydney together to the Sydney Kings. So ironically enough, it was someone going to the Sydney Kings, where I went years later, that opened up my first general manager job. And Grant departed, and the board at the Tigers inserted me in as a general manager at the club. And it was an easy transition for me because I greatly respected Lindsay Gaze. Andrew Gaze was obviously playing. I knew Leonard and Mark Bradkey and Warwick Giddy and the people that played there very, very well from the other activities that I had done with them and the other, history that I had shared with many of those guys. But following Grant taking the Kings job, it opened the door for me to take the Tigers job. In terms of what I learned there at the Tigers, I learned everything because it was a transition period of time. The game had risen to some amazing heights during the 90s. And then it was a period in the late 90s, early 2000s where there was a consolidation. There was some teams exiting the league and not being able to compete anymore, like my old team at Geelong Supercats. They had passed by and they weren't in the league anymore. Newcastle fell by the wayside. The Gold Coast, the first iteration of the Gold Coast, Hobart. And so the league was undergoing a consolidation period, and the Tigers were considered, as you said, to be really the standard bearers of the league, them and and Perth for sure. And I think Adelaide was a real mainstay by then too. But it was a period of time that the game was contracting a bit, I think it's fair to say. And I was in the seat of the Tigers when, for example, we had to look at whether we could really afford to play at Rod Laver Arena anymore, now known as Melbourne Arena. I had to work with the board on that, and eventually a decision was made to move to the much smaller venue that the Tigers then played at a later stage there at the State Netball and Hockey Centre. So I learned a lot about the economics of the game and where that sits, and I didn't have to do a lot of recruiting because the team was the team was pretty much the team. Yeah. It stayed basically the team for many, many years. They had their core players, and so I didn't have to do a lot of that, but I learned a great deal. And some of the sayings that I picked up from Lindsay about the game are sayings that I use even today about player recruitment, and some of the knowledge that I say some because it's almost impossible to gain the knowledge that Lindsay has within his fibre, but you try to gather as much of that as you can, and obviously from guys like Andrew and Bradkey and Copeland that were around for so long, Giddy as well. So no, it was a learning period for me, and it opened up doors for me that followed after the Melbourne Tigers.
Absolutely. Oh, that's great to hear, mate. And you mentioned Andrew and Lindsay Gaze, good friends of yours, obviously. Great relationship with the two of them there. What was it like being part of that environment? One of the best coaches in NBL history, one of the best or the best players in NBL history, in Andrew Gaze. What was that like being a part of that organisation, being around them 24/7, and just seeing the passion and the commitment they had for the game?
I think just humbling is the word that comes to mind, because if you are put in a position where in any way you can be contributing to that or occasionally be asked a question about basketball matters by Lindsay Gaze or Andrew, then it's a tremendous humbling experience. But as I said, to be honest, there wasn't a lot of that to do because the team was very much in place. I did have a little bit to do with one of the recruits that Grant Cadee brought in, who remains a very close friend to this day, which is Phil Handy, who's now at the Lakers. And I was able to help with Phil as he transitioned into the Tigers, and that was a big learning experience for me, because you were bringing a totally different scenario to a team that basically hadn't had an import guard at that other than Leonard for a long time. And so that was a good experience for me, and I think Phil coming in was a good thing. He went on and played at the Razorbacks after that, but that was a good period. I also had a fair bit to do with Daryl Corletto to help bring essentially a young fellow into that program. When I was in the seat at the Tigers, I signed Corletto into the Tigers, and he had been around the program as basically a development program. But I go back a long way with Daryl because of that, and Daryl later played for me in my state league coaching at Werribee and in the VBL. Right. And Daryl was a great young talent at that stage and had a great, long career in the NBL. So I did have a chance to contribute a little bit, but essentially, you don't need to do a lot when Lindsay Gaze is there. From a basketball perspective, he ran the show, and rightly so. Yeah. But I learned a lot from them, and it was a humbling experience. But the thing about the Gaze family, Andrew and Lindsay, but also Mrs. Gaze and Janet and all of them, and now their kids, is they're just tremendous people. And I think the main thing I learned is that if you can surround yourself in a basketball club with good people, you go a long way towards that magical word that everybody kicks around, which is culture. Yeah. And you really, that's just another way of saying people, in my opinion. Culture is people. And so I learned a great deal. And as I said earlier, had it not been for Grant inviting me in there and Andrew and Lindsay accepting me so well, I wouldn't have had the opportunities later that came about at other clubs, including the next one, which was Brisbane.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll come to Brisbane in just a moment, but just to touch on, just to stay in that era of the 90s for a moment, there's been a lot of talk of the NBL now and how it's come back to those, great days in the 90s, or even better than those days. What are your thoughts as to the state of the league now, the position it's in? Is it bigger and better than it was back in the 90s in those great days, or has it still got a bit of work to do before we get back to that time?
Well, I don't want to be a fence sitter because it's difficult, and that's not what the question's about. But it is difficult at any point to really measure off eras, because you don't have the ability of playing them at the same time, and that's the nature of it. And that's why the LeBron Jordan debate is meaningless, because you can't put them next to each other in their prime. You can't put a 25-year-old LeBron and a 25-year-old Jordan next to each other. And likewise, you can't put a 2020 version of our league next to the year 2000 version of our league with any level of science. So you have to go on your memories, which can be flawed. The recency effect is a big thing. I'm a huge believer in the recency effect. That is to say that you remember a little bit more about what you're seeing in front of you right now than maybe you did 20 years ago. And then countering that is the kind of absence makes the heart grow fonder effect, where you tend to gloss over any problems that a league had or a team had when it's 20 or 30 years down the line. So, there's a lot of things to do with, in your mind that play tricks on you when you try to compare eras. Yeah. But what I do believe is that where we're at now in 2020 is a damn sight along the path, way, way, way more positive than we were, say, 10 years ago. And I think with what Larry Kesselman and Jeremy Lowleger and his team have done is they've actually brought basketball back to a level of prominence that it didn't have for a very long time. Is it the same as that era? I don't know. I'm a huge believer that you fall in love the hardest the first time. And I think that when Australian sport followers fell in love with basketball the first time, they fell pretty hard. They fell pretty deeply in love with the product. And I think in Melbourne, where I was, or Victoria, at one point you had the Geelong Supercats, the Eastside Spectres, the Melbourne Tigers, the North Melbourne Giants, all playing on a regular basis down at that Melbourne Olympic Park precinct. And I remember very distinctly one evening, it's just one evening that always stands out, where I was with the Supercats as an assistant coach. We played the Giants in the old Glass House, which is now obviously the Collingwood Football Club training facility. And we played in the Glass House before a packed house. Believe Bruce Palmer was coaching the Giants. Across the road, Melbourne was playing either Eastside, or they may have become the Magic by then. I can't remember, but they were playing the Gorgon-led team during that era when the Gaze-Gorgon rivalry and the Tigers-Magic rivalry was massive. And they had a full house. And on the same night, at the same time, Collingwood was playing Carlton at the MCG, which was only another 200 metres over the bridge or 300 metres over the bridge, and they had a full house. And I remember thinking, if Melbourne's not the sporting capital of the world tonight, I don't really know what was. And I think, I think that was a very heady era. And I think I inadvertently hit one note there, which is that the game was played in the winter at that point.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think in terms of being able to get fringe NBA level imports, it's one thing that's overlooked is that you could get imports back at that stage of our NBL's history without the imports believing they were closing the door for that season on the NBA, because they didn't have to make that decision. They didn't have to say, am I hanging around in the G League, what we now call the G League? Am I hanging around there to be one heartbeat away from the NBA, or am I coming to Australia? That's what they have to decide now. Yeah. But back then they didn't have to decide that, because we were the only big league at that time of year in the world because of our Southern Hemisphere location. We played in our winter, which was everyone else's summer. And if you look at even this to this day, what really happens in the summer? Okay, you've got NBA Summer League, which goes for 10 days. You've got a league in Puerto Rico, which goes for a month or five weeks maybe. Other than that, there is no other league. So we did have the advantage of owning the basketball landscape globally at that point, which I think did have an impact on recruiting and being able to get some players in. And that's why some pretty high-level guys came. They stayed for different reasons, guys like Leroy and Cal and those guys. But they came because they didn't have to shut their door on anything back in the States. That's my sort of take on it. So that is a factor that I think is little talked about. But there were reasons for the league to shift to summer when they did, and there's been reasons for them not to shift back to winter, which they have not done. But that is a difference between the eras. And in answer to your initial question, I think it's hard to separate where we are now from where we were at the zenith of that point in time. But what has changed is there is a great deal more competition now, even in the summer, with A-League soccer, with the way the AFL and cricket and everything else has extended their seasons. All of the major sports in Australia, whether you're talking rugby league, whether you're talking AFL, with you're talking cricket, they've all started to creep into other areas of the calendar that they never used to creep.
That's right.
Nobody in the AFL or VFL back then even dreamt of playing something in, say, February, like they do now with the NAB Cup. They didn't even dream of that. So it is a more competitive environment. So you could make the argument that for the NBL to be a viable and relevant product, which they certainly are, in this day and age is harder than what it was in that day and age. So that's probably the biggest difference. But I'd say the eras are really, really hard to compare. Both really great eras.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully we continue to move forward even through this pandemic and all that's been going on in the world. But you did mention about 10 years ago in the state of the league, even 10 years ago. It's amazing to think. I remember the Sydney Spirit at the time getting about 800-900 to the entertainment centre to watch a game, which was for me probably the lowest point in the league's history. But I remember talking to Jason Smith, the famous Jason Smith back in the day, and talking to him about why he thought the league declined so much in the really was only probably 5, maybe 10 year period. And he mentioned about the ownership coming in and owners coming in more to, get $1 out of the league as opposed to their interest being about basketball and the sport in Australia. So I guess as the league grows, how do we counteract ownership coming in or owners coming in to make money out of the league as opposed to having the best interests of the sport at heart?
Well, I think we're really lucky that most owners have that understanding, and to be really honest, very few owners make any big money out of this league. So there may have been a period, as Jason said, that some owners came in with that intent, but it's pretty widely accepted that most owners have got to come in with a longer term view, doing the right thing by the sport, building their brand and doing everything right to have any real notion of making it a sustainable financial product. And it can be done. And if you look at Perth, they've done it. And if you look at New Zealand at different stages, they've done it. And most clubs have done it at some point in time. Adelaide's done it in the past. But it's such a competitive environment, and there's so many pitfalls if you don't get things right with the way you run your clubs. And this has been the case for decades, that it is difficult to turn $1 unless you really get things right. So I believe that most, if not all, of the owners in our league now actually have the right intent, and they believe that they're there to try to make the sport better, work within the NBL and make this thing collectively work. So I think the only way you really do what you're saying, which is to do the right thing by the sport, is get the right people, and the right people is the right answer. And I think there's been some really positive moves in the last few years. I think Kevin Martin coming in to own the Brisbane Bullets brings a lot of credibility. I think that there's an ownership around the league collectively now that tends to really want to build this product into a great thing, and hopefully it holds us in good stead in the future. And I think the league's ownership with Larry, again, I've mentioned him once or twice already, but it's huge because he sets the tone. He has shown his passion by putting his money where his mouth was. He came in as a sponsor at the Melbourne Tigers initially.
That's right.
And then he became an owner of the Tigers. Then he became the owner of the Tigers. Or I could have that wrong. He might have skipped from being a sponsor to full owner. I can't remember, but he bought the team, and in the end, he was the owner. And then to go and actually then take the step from there to own the league at a time that the league was not looking great, was a huge boost for the league. In fact, it's hard to actually quantify how big that was for the league. I think it was a difference maker between the league possibly not being there or going into some other lesser form, which would have been tragic for the NBL to lose all of what it had built. And he ensured it didn't, and he's now ensured that it's gone somewhere from there. So I think when you've got an owner of the league who's that committed, then hopefully the other owners of the teams follow suit and say, well, we might not agree on everything all the time, but we've got an owner of the league that is really, really steadfast in his approach to make this league, great. So I think most owners are thinking that way about their teams respectively as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's great that he's come on board. I remember Jason saying as well back then the league needs someone like a Frank Lowy character, like the A-League took off because of Frank Lowy. The league needed someone like that to come in, and they did. So thank goodness for that. But let's change gears to Brisbane because you spent a number of years up there as well. I know you live in Brisbane. It's close to your heart, the Brisbane Bullets. So Just want to take you back to when you first came in. It was a bit of a rebuilding phase from memory. And over the years, you built what I would think, in my opinion, is the greatest ever roster to be graced an NBL court. Here's some of the names: Sam McKinnon, Mark Bradkey, CJ Bruton, Ebby Arah, Stephen Black. Like, that's a roster right there. How'd you fit him all under the salary cap for starters?
Well, that's the question that everybody wanted to ask. I mean,
that's right.
To be really honest, we actually had a situation where we had so many sponsors around the the edge of our program that the owner, Eddie Groves, had very, very substantial business and personal links with, and had built a really strong network of businesses around that club. And nobody would choose to believe it, but believe it or not, in terms of what we paid for basketball salary, we were able to fit it under the cap. What we paid through businesses and what we were able to do on the outside of the club, which was cleared by the NBL because they were legitimate jobs. I'll give you a real life example. Stephen Black went off and worked for Rick Petterwood at Hoop to Hoop, which is a basketball uniform manufacturing company. Yeah. And this was not a fake job. This was a job where he went into that place and worked 3 days a week, if my memory serves me correctly, was out on the road, demonstrating to the possible clients at the associations what these uniforms look like, how this could work, how this was good for them. And Steve took that with both hands and actually got paid by Hoop to Hoop to do that job. And we replicated that right across the board. And a lot of people have never really bothered to find out how that actually occurred. Now, those in the NRL are called third-party deals. That's what we call them in the NRL. And I had a chance to work at the Broncos a few years back now and saw that at close hand. And there's often debate about, how close those third-party deals are to clubs and that type of thing. But it is a system that sponsors can actually become involved in. And that's how we were able to get a number of our players to actually have an involvement in Brisbane outside of just being paid to play basketball. The other thing that we were very, very, that was very advantageous for us is because strength builds strength in rosters. And again, if you look in the NBA, there are players that actually come to NBA clubs, as much as nobody seems to believe it here in the NBL. But in the NBA, nobody actually blinks an eyelid when I think back to David West when he went to the Spurs and he turned down an $11 million deal at Indiana and went to the Spurs and played for the minimum at the time, which was 1.2 as the minimum exception. He left $10 million on the table. Sometimes players actually decide to go where they want to go. And you look at the Bulls teams, you look at a guy like Ron Harper, what he did there, turned down other big deals. You look at the Golden State Warriors just accumulating pieces during their run. And I could go on. And we actually did have the advantage of a number of players, including Mark Bradkey, who came to us for well under what we thought we would have to pay them. And we also were advantaged by guys that went on to become great stars. Adam Gibson is an example. But Adam Gibson was paid well under at the Bullets because he was starting out his journey and he was on a veteran roster that was well advanced in age from Gibbo and also well advanced in what their salary expectations were. And he played a longer game, came in as a rookie, did a great job, was part of great days. And no doubt, I'm assuming, has received good paydays later. But in terms of our payday to a guy like Gibbo, to a guy like Brad Williamson, to a guy like Dusty Reichart, we actually had a very big, vast divide between the higher paid players and the lower paid players at the time. So our total spend may not have been quite as much as everybody assumed. But yes, we did have big ticket items, CJ, Ebby Arah, Sammy McKinnon, even Dylan Boucher to get him across from Perth. We had to obviously make payments, but we were just in a really advantageous position because of how much interest there was in our Bullets team and how much business connectivity we had from our team. And I think, you mentioned Jason earlier. The other big team that was, I think, very similar at the time was the Kings. Yeah. And if you look at what was happening at the Kings, now Jason would be able to tell you much more because he was close with those people. But my understanding is that people like the Macquarie Bank, the guys at the Macquarie Bank that were owners of that team, I believe were doing really similar things to what Eddie was in terms of saying, well, what's our business network? How can we get some of our guys involved in learning genuine skills. And I think it is genuine. And I think to do that is a smart thing. So that's how we did it at the Bullets. But that was only the last couple of years. The first 4 or 5 years was we were successful. But there was not a huge spend on those years compared to those last few years, including the year we won it. And I agree with you. I'm biased, but I think that was the greatest roster that was put together. I think Joey Wright was amazingly good for that team. I think he read that team as well as any coach has ever read a team before. He had them humming, and it was a great period to be part of.
Absolutely. You mentioned Joey Wright, and this is a question I had later on, but we'll come to it now about coaching and the importance of, first and foremost, I guess, vision and purpose within your organisation. I think for any great organisation, you need to have a clear vision of where you want to head and purpose as to why you exist. And I guess part of that puzzle piece is getting the right coach for the team. So you can have a team full of stars, and we've seen that with the Bulls in the Last Dance documentary recently. You can have all the stars that you want, but if you don't have that key coach that can bring them together, that can sell that vision and that purpose, you're not going to really end up where you want to go. So first and foremost, for you, how important is having the clear vision and purpose for your organisation, but also the importance of getting the right coach, the right fit in terms of the coach?
Well, not surprisingly, the vision and purpose of the organisation usually starts at the owner. And it doesn't mean the owner has to be day-to-day engaged in your basketball decisions or day-to-day engaged in running the business decisions, but it does mean that he or she tends to key off what follows. And it's the snake is always led by the head. And when you can be led by the head very, very well, you move along really nicely and really quickly. And when you can't, it's different. And I think that I've always been a big believer, for example, that you shouldn't have too many owners, because I think too many masters can be hard to answer to. Yeah. And I note with interest that places like Perth very rarely have had a large amount of owners. They've had dual owners, or sometimes 3 or 4 owners, I think, from memory, but there's almost always been just a majority owner. And I think that the vision and purpose is best, accomplished when you have a pretty clear ownership vision. So that's the first thing. And I think that, coaching is, in my opinion, a right place, right time thing for the group. I think that you do have to find the right fit. And I think coaches are such a unique group of people. And I find that in today's day and age, most of the coaching knowledge is pretty much on a par. I mean, some guys are incredibly gifted in terms of their study of the game and their take on the game. But by and large, most coaches have a really good knowledge of what they're doing. But the man management aspect is what it's all about, because you're dealing with rosters of, in our case, 10 or 11 players, plus maybe 4 or 5 off to the side, development players and training players. It's not a big group of people, but there's a vast, a vast difference in egos, in personalities, in types, in expectations from the players, and a man manager has to, really have an understanding of all of those things and pull that together into a common direction. And that's not revolutionary to say that, but actually to do it is a different matter, and to do it really effectively. So I think man management is really the key. And I think that it just varies according to the group needs that you have. So I think the ownership sets the vision and passion for the organization. I think the coach and the general manager have to try to execute that. And if you get all those things aligned, you have success. And success is measured in many different ways. Championship success is a certain type of success, but the reputation of your organization is another one. That's important, and sometimes that takes a hit when things go wrong, or there's a period of time that most organizations go through where you have to recalibrate things and get back on track, and most organizations have that. I mean, when I came into Brisbane, for example, Brisbane was undergoing a really, really big transition from a period where they'd been ultra successful through the 80s and early 90s and really into the sort of almost mid 90s. And then a period of real wilderness from like 95, 96 all the way through until 2001, 2. When we came in. And so at the time, it was what was needed most in Brisbane was steadiness and a rebuild, and to give the fans and the media there and the observers of the club, to give them a sense that, okay, they have a plan and they're back on track. And yeah, every team goes through that at some point, and that's when you need the people to really help you on that build.
Absolutely. I guess that translates into life in general. If you don't have a clear purpose for life or direction, then when hardship hits, or hardship that we're in at the moment, it's hard to navigate through that without that sense of purpose. Whether that's I exist to be a good father or a good husband, it gives you that sense of purpose to get through the hard times, and particularly from a sporting organisation point of view, as you mentioned. So, just moving into hard times in your life. One of those was when you lost your older brother, John. And for me, being involved with Sports Chaplaincy Australia, I've heard what a great guy he was. And talking about vision, he was a visionary, very much so, from what I understand. And from very much from working with Indigenous Australians' point of view, but also for chaplaincy within the sport of basketball. He also worked with the Western Bulldogs. First and foremost, can you share a bit about John as a person? And obviously I didn't get to meet him, but I've heard from people who did what a great person he was, a great visionary, as I said. Reaching out to Indigenous Australians. And can you just share with everyone what kind of person John was?
Yeah, well, absolutely. It'd be a pleasure. We'd need a separate podcast to try to try to list his achievements as a person, because he was incredibly unique and very rare. But John was a qualified pilot. He got his aviation training in the United States, and initially it looked like he might go down that path, but his flying took him to the Northern Territory, where he took a job with a missionary outfit that basically flew missions in and out of some of the most remote parts of Australia. And so he fell in love through that initial job that he had with the airline, with the air company that he was with. He fell in love with the Northern Territory, and he fell in love with the people, and he had a passion for the potential of doing something that might contribute to them, and he felt very heavily contributed to by them as a population. Just everybody, just all Territorians, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, just felt like that was an amazing place, and it very much captured him as a person. And so once he was married to Jennifer, and kids came along and so forth, he realized he couldn't live in the remotest parts of the outback anymore, which he had done, by the way, when he was a single man. He lived halfway between Darwin and Alice Springs, and I can tell you, I've been up there a number of times with him, and halfway between Alice Springs and Darwin, there's not a lot there. It's the Tanami Desert, and it's really remote. And he lived there, and but having a family coming and married and so forth, he then was back in Victoria, but wanted to stay connected and wanted to do something, and he started an outfit that eventually became Red Dust Role Models, Red Dust Role Models, of which Jason Smith, who you mentioned, and Darren Smith, and many people contributed to that. Chris Anstey, he had V8 supercar drivers, he had AFL people, he had Eddie Maguire travel with him to Alice Springs on an occasion or two. Luke Darcy was heavily involved. There was many people from many walks of life, and especially in the sporting area, that wanted to have a better understanding of this passion that John had to take role models into the most remote parts of Australia, give a positive, life-changing message of hope, do great humanitarian things at the same time, but really just be there to do things that could help those communities, because he felt like those communities didn't have what we have here in the east coast of Australia and the more densely populated parts of this country. So he did have an incredible passion. He had always had chaplaincy jobs, He worked as a sports chaplain under Brian Gronigen at Gronigen's teams. Back at the Supercats days, even before I was at the Supercats. In fact, he wasn't there at the same time as I was, but he had worked at the Supercats. He worked at as you said, the Western Bulldogs, and many other places along the way that he contributed to in the area of sports chaplaincy, which with John's approach was not about talking. It was more about living. It was more about being a are you there, mate? Someone just tried to make a call.
Yep.
So maybe you can just edit that bit out. But it was much to do with living by example and just trying to be there for the athletes that he had a passion for. So his main two passions in terms of day to day outside of his family were Indigenous population of this country and wanting to do something positive in that respect, and athletes, because he had a real affinity for the challenges that they go through. And unbeknownst to a lot of people in day-to-day life, athletes go through some challenges that are very unique to athletes. And there are some dark periods of time. The thing we think of most is when they retire, but there's some very dark periods of time when things don't go your way. You might be dropped from selection for your team. You might not make it. You might have had a bad game. You're commented on, especially in this day and age. You're commented on heavily by the media, social media. You're heavily scrutinized. Yeah. And so John, always had a really strong passion to try to help those that he could in the area of professional athletics as well. So that's a little bit about him. He was unfortunately called away from us far too early, in our opinion, but there was another plan there that we're not aware of, and we lost him a number of years ago. But it was an amazing contribution that he made, and one that is quite daunting to try to live up to from a human standpoint. But some people are incredibly gifted, and he was one of those people.
Yeah, well, yeah, you're right, mate. We may have to do another podcast based on him and his journey, his life. Yeah. Sounds like an amazing guy.
Absolutely.
Just to finish up in the time that we have, you mentioned Brian Gronigen, and without touching on it, we know the success the Kings had in that 2000s decade, 3 straight championships, amazing team, amazing roster. Like your experience up in Brisbane, the ownership fell apart. The club no longer existed through 2009, 2010, I believe. Came back for the 2010-2011 season. Number of years of trying to get back on the right track, and then you come in as general manager 2015, 2016, I believe, or a bit after. What was the organisation like, first of all, the Kings, when you arrived, and what led you to sort of take that step of taking on the role at the Kings?
Well, after I had finished with the Brisbane Bullets and I stayed in Brisbane, I worked for 2 organisations two different entities at that time. One was the Queensland government, where I became chief advisor to the sports minister for a period of time, for a couple of years, and worked in politics and helped in that area. And the second was the Brisbane Broncos. And both with the Broncos and in my role with the government as the sports advisor to the minister, and previously when I'd run the Bullets, the one gentleman that I probably interacted with most was Harvey Lister from an organisation now called ASM Global, but it was AEG, and they are a venue operator through Australia. They manage Suncorp Stadium, Perth Entertainment Centre, or now known as RAC Arena, and so on, and Cairns Convention Centre, Brisbane, Burndall, Brisbane South Bank, a whole lot of them. And Harvey's a huge player in the entertainment and venue space in Australia. And I had dealt with him, as I said, at the 3 places at Brisbane that I had been, the government, Bullets and Broncos. And Harvey had always said to me that he felt like what we had done at the Bullets, and we were obviously tenants of his at those arenas in Brisbane during my Bullets days, he really felt that we had done a really good job running an NBL franchise. And that was a tribute to all those people that were involved. But he had always said to me, if I ever go into owning an NBL team again, because he had actually owned the Bullets way, way back, a long, long time ago. But he said that if he ever went into team ownership again, he would give me a call, because he felt like he'd like me to be involved in that. And that was humbling. And I thought it was a throwaway line. But years later, he decided he wanted to acquire the Sydney Kings because they were playing out of his arena at Kudos Bank Arena. Or sorry, to be accurate, they weren't yet playing out of Kudos Bank Arena. They were playing down the road at the State Sports Centre.
That's right.
Also within the Olympic Park precinct. But he had a vision that perhaps he would pick them up and move them into the venue that he knew best because he was managing it at Kudos Bank Arena. It was an AEG venue. Yeah. And he felt like it would be a good fit for the Kings to be at this arena. And so he bought the Kings and he brought me in as managing director of the club. And I actually went back to doing something that I hadn't done since the early days of the Bullets, which was running both sides of the business, both the commercial side and the basketball side, which I don't do at Adelaide. And I didn't do it and I didn't do in the latter days at the Bullets. I really liked to concentrate on just running the basketball. But I came in at the Kings as managing director. And for the first 2 out of the 3 years that I was at the Kings, I ran both sides of the business. And it was a tremendous period of time. And we had a major revamp to do at the Kings. They had gone, I guess, to a smaller mode of operation out of a smaller arena. Things had just been a little different for them compared to their heady days at the Sydney Entertainment Centre back when they were there. And you'd know about those days. And that era had passed. And they needed a revamp. And they needed more than just a new tin of paint on the front. They needed a real revamp. And Harvey is a marketing savant. He's a guru when it comes to how to position and really build a brand. He's very good at it. And so I was just lucky enough to be running his business for him and really sharing in his vision and trying to institute the changes that he felt could be made. And I took care of the recruiting, and we obviously brought in Andrew Gaze as our coach. And that had tremendous cut through in Sydney, which is not easy to do because the Sydney crowd's a tough one to get, and the Sydney media is a tough one to actually have notice you. And Andrew's a luminary figure in the game and had immediate resonance in Sydney as a well-known entity, a person that everybody respected. And so we brought in Andrew, and we really, Kevin Lish, who we see today, is just retired. He was my first recruited him even before we installed a coach. Brought in Newley as well before we'd even installed a coach. And I brought Brad back from Spain where he'd been playing. So they were heady days. They were great days. We had a lot of work to do. We needed to fill a stadium. Much of what I did at Sydney was about rebuilding the brand and about rebuilding the relevance of Sydney. And of course, that built up to the crescendo, which was bringing Andrew Bogut back from the States, and making the playoffs. And I remember distinctly at the end of the 3 years that I was there, my last game there, we had, I think it was 15,000 or so in the arena against Melbourne United. Unfortunately, we bowed out in the playoffs, but I looked into the stands. There was 15,000 people there. Andrew Bogut was our starting center. Andrew Gaze was on the sidelines. We had a genuinely very good team, albeit we didn't play well in that particular series. And I felt like, in 3 years, we've actually, with the support of the Sydney people, we were humbled to have turned it around. And I felt like that's about as good as it's probably going to get, other than if we had been able to win the championship. Yeah. And I had always committed to 3 years, and it was 3 years that Andrew and I, Gaze that is, had said we'd commit to Harvey for, and it was 3 great years, and away we went. So it was a good time.
Absolutely, mate. You guys did a great job and built it to what it is today. Just as we finish up, obviously with Adelaide now, bit of controversy at the end of the season, end of last season, but obviously put that in the past. Moving forward now with a new coach and starting to build that roster again. How's things looking for the upcoming season?
Well, you're right. I mean, everything pre-COVID seems like a millennium away now, and there's some serious things that have happened that probably put into perspective what actually happened at the end of the last season. But that was the end of an era, and we thank those that were part of that. Including the coaching staff, the players, some of whom are still with us, and many of whom aren't. But we feel like that was. I mean, look, a few years ago they were playing off for a championship, which many observers believe they should have won against Melbourne United, and some unfortunate things happened there. So they had a successful era. Now it's up to us to try to take that to the next level and do the best we can. And I've always said this about any team that I've been lucky enough to be associated with, and that is that what you are essentially is a custodian of the brand, and you're a custodian of the history that's at those clubs. And Adelaide has a deep history, a rich history. The things that Phil Smythe did, the things that players and coaches before him, right the way through, that people probably don't think about much. But the Don Shipway era, the Mike Dunlap era, the Marty Clark era, all of those things contribute. Kenneth Cole era, a great character in Adelaide history and a successful one. And all of those people contribute to the brand that is the Adelaide 36ers. And that's why Grant Kelly, our owner, myself, Connor Henry coming in, Josh Giddey, what we are is just simply today's version of the Adelaide 36ers, and we have a huge legacy to protect, to build on. And if you're successful, which you look back to Sydney, what I just talked about a moment ago, all I was hoping is that we leave the place better than we found it.
Yeah.
And if we can somehow take Adelaide, which is already an incredibly strong brand and a great place, and if we can take the 36ers and somehow leave it better than we found it, then we'll have done our job. And we don't have that track record yet. I've just got there. Connor's just got there. Grant's been there, but he believes there's unfinished business in building this team into something that we can really show the Adelaide and South Australian public that they need to pile into the Adelaide Entertainment Centre to see. That is the job for us. Whilst not denigrating the brand, whilst not ever doing anything other than paying respect to those that have gone before us, and just take that thing to the next level. And I think with Connor Henry, he is the right man to do that, because he's respectful and he's about the future. He will draw on the history of the past, but only to assist the future. And we have a great opportunity. I think that the league with 9 teams only is incredibly competitive. To make the playoffs in this league is a serious achievement. To go through the type of revamp that we're going through, bringing a 17-year-old kid like Josh Giddey in to be a good part of the role, means that it'll be a real challenge for us, but we feel like we're up for the challenge. We've got some huge announcements to make July 1st when we're allowed to actually enter the free agency period. We've been working behind the scenes on some player announcements, so we're excited about that. And, we think that whenever the season starts, whether that's late October, November, whatever it is, we think the Adelaide Entertainment Centre is going to be really buzzing, and we're looking forward to it. So Adelaide is the next step in the journey for me and for many that are around me that are coming into this.
Fantastic, mate. You're doing a great job, mate, and could talk to you all day. But I really appreciate your time today, mate, and all the best for the upcoming season, whenever that is.
No problem. No problem at all. It'll start at some point, and I appreciate the chance to have a chat. I really appreciate it.
No worries, Jeff. Awesome, mate. Thanks again for your time, buddy. All the best.
No problem. Talk to you later. See ya.
See you, mate. Bye.